Hi everyone, and welcome to the final lecture on qualitative research methods. In this video, we're going to explore observation and fieldwork methodologies. It's one of my favorite, and I think you'll find it really interesting. Let's get started. Fieldwork is a unique type of research method because it requires that the researcher study the participant in their natural environment, meaning the places that they live, work, study, socialize, etc. This means that fieldwork cannot be accomplished without going out into, well, the field. There's no staying in the lab during this type of method. The reason that fieldwork is so important is that it can give the researcher so much information that he or she would never be able to capture in an artificial setting. Think about your own life. If you're sitting in an office conference room with a stranger and you were asked to tell your life story, how would you describe yourself? Now picture the same question, but instead you're sitting in your own house surrounded by your family. Would that conversation be the same? For me, I can tell you it would not be. Even if I was sharing the same content with you, my surroundings would influence my body language, my comfort level, and probably my vernacular. It would be more informal, and I think my story would reflect that. Then you have the added potential of input from my family members and disruption from my dogs. So you can imagine that my life story would be very different if it was gathered in both ways. Fieldwork and observation gives us this ability to see our subjects in a way they simply cannot do by interacting with them only in the lab or classroom. The challenge is that fieldwork and observation is really time-consuming. The big qualitative research studies that are studied in most sociology courses are studies in which the researcher has literally gone to live with the subjects for a period of time. This type of research isn't something you can do in an afternoon. In order to become comfortable with the researcher must spend a lot of times with the subject, even if they're not actively collecting data. Because in fieldwork, everything is data, even when you don't intend it to be. When conducting fieldwork, you have to choose your role conception. Role conception means how embedded the researcher becomes in the community being studied. Role conception exists on a continuum from complete observer to complete participant. A complete observer means that the researcher has no contact with the subjects whatsoever. This is the researcher who is standing behind the one-way mirror, watching the subjects interact with one another. On the other hand, a complete participant means that the researcher has taken on the role of a participant in the group fully, with no role distinctions whatsoever. Now, neither of these roles are very common because both come with hard disadvantages. Complete observers may make their subjects feel uncomfortable, making them change their behavior, and they're also less likely to get valid information because they're not interacting with the subjects at all. Complete participants may lose objectivity and do what we call going native. This means that the researcher becomes so ingrained in the population they're studying that they cannot view it as a researcher anymore and they lose objectivity. The two roles in the middle are the more common role conceptualizations. Participants as observer means that the researcher is known as a researcher to a small select group, but interacts with the majority of the group as though they were a participant. The observer as participant means that everyone knows the researcher is studying them, but the researcher does interact and try to participate in group events. However, due to their status as a researcher, they participate as an outsider, not fully part of the group. The choice of researcher role is personal choice on behalf of the researcher. The role choice may also be determined by the researcher's ability to blend in with the subjects and any safety concerns involving the population. I want to tell you a little bit about a research study by one of my professors, Dr. Pete Simi, because I think it really illustrates several of the points that I'm talking about in this week's lecture. Dr. Simi's research focused on extremist groups, particularly those involved in the white power movement. For his dissertation, he did a descriptive study of how the spaces in a white power movement look like. Dr. Simi's goal was to identify what the white power movement looked like, how its members interacted, and also how the white power ideals were transmitted during everyday life. He has since translated this work into a focus on desistance research, meaning that he now focuses on the processes that occur when someone leaves the white power movement and adapts mainstream views regarding racial diversity and integration. At the time of his dissertation, Dr. Simi was working with other colleagues in California, and he located a key informant who agreed to help introduce him into several white power movement groups in the California area. During his research, Dr. Simi took on the role of participant as observer, so his informant knew he was a researcher, but most of the other individuals in his research did not. Part of this was because he wanted individuals to be more real with their behavior and their discussions around him, and the other part was due to safety concerns. The white power movement is generally distrustful of outsiders, and Dr. Simi was worried that he might be in danger if his identity was known more openly. During his fieldwork, Dr. Simi took part in several music events, white power rallies, and even stayed the night with his informant and other members of the movement. Throughout his interactions, he was making notes of the interactions and living spaces of the group, although due to the secrecy of his research role, he took notes surreptitiously as much as possible. He told us that he would take notes during quick trips to the bathroom if there were really important things he wanted to jot down as quickly as possible, and he would also write more extensively about his experiences every night after he left the interactions. Dr. Simi published a book about his experiences called American Swastika. Several parts of the book really exemplify what qualitative research brings to the table. Remember, I told you a little bit about this previously. One chapter in his book describes how the white power movement is present in everyday life in the living spaces of its members. And one of the examples he discusses is how the decorations in a home can help propagate the white power belief of its owners. You know how like grandma always has that display cabinet with all the fancy figurines and the family photos? What Dr. Simi saw in the homes of the Aryan Nation and the KKK members was a similar display case, but there would be swastikas and pictures of Hitler that were mixed in with all the regular family mementos. Dr. Simi noted that this type of display helped to normalize the parents' extremist attitudes and also helped to transmit those values to the next generation. Extremist symbols were also normalized by their inclusion in everyday practices like hate messages in children's games of tag and birthday cakes in the shape of swastikas. One of the things that Dr. Simi had to be mindful about in his research was how comfortable he felt participating in the movement. Remember that most people did not know he was a researcher, so he had to be careful about not participating in regular events because that could potentially out him as an outsider. But this created some difficult ethical choices for him. In his book, he talks about the Sieg Heil chant and Nazi salute, which are a common part of family events and white power rallies. He had to balance his own ethical and moral guidelines with his safety when determining how much he could and could not participate in, particularly in situations when the group was intoxicated or was riled up against non-movement members. Dr. Simi's safety concerns were definitely not unfounded. His fieldwork with the Aryan Nation came to an abrupt end one night while sleeping on his key informant's couch. His informant came to talk to him late one evening and told him that he had calmed things down, but there were plans to knife Dr. Simi at the next music rally. It turns out that some individuals in the group had looked up his name, and Dr. Simi was listed on the website at his university as a graduate student in the criminal justice department. Now, obviously, this was a reference to his degree program, but to those individuals, being part of the criminal justice program meant that he was associated with law enforcement, and that meant he was a traitor. Dr. Simi's informant assured him that he had stopped the plan by assuring the guys that Dr. Simi was okay, but he thought Dr. Simi should just know just in case, somebody came up to him with a knife. Dr. Simi told us that he thanked his informant, went to bed like normal, got up in the middle of the night, grabbed his bags, and got the heck out of Dodge. And that was the end of his fieldwork.
Around the same time, I reached out to Aryan Nations. At that time, Aryan Nations had 20 acres of property up in northern Idaho, just outside of Coeur d'Alene. And Aryan Nations had a church, and the church was Church of Jesus Christ Christian. A little bit redundant, but that's all right. It was listed in the phone book. So I just called up information and said, do you have a listing for the church, blah, blah, blah. And they gave me the number, so I call the number. This woman answers. She turns out she's the office manager. I tell her that I'm a student, interested in doing some research, wanted to come up and visit and meet with you. She said, ask me one question. Are you white? I said, yes, I am. She said, you're more than welcome. So that was that easy. So I went up, the first time I went up to Aryan Nations, it was during a time when they weren't having any gatherings or anything like that. The founder, Richard Butler, had his home there. There was probably a half a dozen other folks that were living there full time, just kind of running the organization. They did a lot of propaganda, production, and distribution. They were doing websites by that time. They had a church sermon every Sunday. So I went up on a Thursday. I interviewed Butler. I interviewed the office manager and her spouse. Spent some time just hanging out. And they said, well, why don't you come back to the church service on Sunday? So I did that. There's about 30 people at the church service. We went down to Coeur d'Alene. Coeur d'Alene is, it's a big, like, tourist area. I mean, they've got this world-class golf course, and Aryan Nations, when they were located there, was always kind of a little bit of an eyesore for Coeur d'Alene in many respects. So we go downtown lunchtime, and we go to a nice Italian restaurant, and there's like 20 of us. And some of the guys are like neo-Nazi skinheads. There's like a Nazi biker who's decked out in leather and tats and everything. There's Richard Butler, who's a household figure. Everybody knows who Butler is. So we are very visible, and everybody's staring at us, and they can't find a table big enough for us, so they got to cobble together a bunch of tables right in the middle of the restaurant. And of course, we're quite a spectacle. And it's at that point I actually realized that when I was sitting with them in that restaurant setting and people were speaking in hushed tones to each other about the Nazis being in the restaurant, I was one of them, And that I remember that just being such a weird feeling for me, because I wasn't, but I was in that setting. And that was something that, I had to kind of deal with throughout the research, was this desire to want to get close to them, but not too close. This is a photo I took a couple years later up at Aryan Nations. This would have been 99. And I'll point out something here. This guy here with the beard, that's Sikh Highland. So his name's Gus. Gus is actually an undergraduate student doing research. And I'd met Gus just right, maybe the day before. And Gus was just going for it. So my positioning in the field was much more as an observer. I got to know people really well. I, in some cases, lived with people, but I wasn't running around doing Nazi salutes and that kind of stuff. But Gus just fit right in, and he's going for it from a research standpoint. And we were in church at one point, and when they get in church, in these kind of gatherings like church or music shows, they start doing in unison like chants and salutes, and so the Hail Victory, White Power, things of that nature. Well, they were doing the Hail Victory chants, and Gus was chanting right along with them, doing the Nazi salutes, and I was just standing there observing. And so afterwards, I said to Gus, I said, "Well, do you feel weird, kind of going as much as you're getting involved, And he said, "Well, no, because when I say Hail Victory, I'm not saying their Hail Victory." So psychologically, that's how he was trying to work it out in his own mind. What's significant about this story, though, is that so that's his college professor who had basically introduced him to the field. So I was in contact with the guy in the red and black, and about a year later, I was talking to the college professor on the phone, and I said, because I liked Gus. Gus was a very likable guy. I said, "Well, how's Gus doing?" He goes, "Well, it's not a good story." And well, what happened? He goes, "Well, we got back from Aryan Nations, and I started hearing rumors that he was hanging out with the local neo-Nazis in their town where they lived. And so about 6 months in, he went to Gus's place to check on him, and Gus opened the door, and sure enough, Nazi banner on the wall, and Gus had fallen in. He had what's called in research going native. He went to, he started out doing research, but he became one of his subjects. He over-identified with his subjects. So it is definitely a risk of, doing this kind of research.
So what can we learn from Dr. Simi's research? First, it exemplifies the time consumption that I talked about before. It took a lot of time and a lot of field work on his part to be able to complete his project. He had to gain the trust of his informant in order to earn access to the hidden populations. While he was interacting with this group, he had to be aware of his role as both a participant and a researcher, and had to use his own judgments to determine how much participation was enough. Once he was discovered, he had to conclude the research study entirely for his own safety. While this isn't necessarily the common experience with fieldwork, it does show you some of the big challenges that make this work difficult. I do want to show you a short excerpt from this video where Dr. Simi himself discusses some of his feelings about research and shares a story about another researcher who went native. Another thing that Dr. Simi's research highlights is the fact that not every researcher can do fieldwork with every population. In Dr. Simi's case, the restriction was really obvious. If he had answered no to the question, "Are you white?" then he would never have been able to gain access to the compound. So in this case, Dr. Simi's race was an important factor in determining whether he could or could not complete the research study he was proposing. That's not to say that a researcher always has to look like the population they're studying. In fact, I actively disagree with that. But in this particular case, given the prejudices that were held by the research population, the personal characteristics of the researcher did come into play. Moral and ethical concerns also play a role in qualitative research selection. When I describe my research experience with my students, I invariably get at least one student who says, I could never work with sex offenders. I would be too blank, emotional, angry, hostile, whatever. Those feelings are perfectly legitimate, and that's what I always tell students. There are research questions out there that will be too far beyond your own moral or ethical boundaries, groups that you don't feel confident interacting with or cannot be objective with. In some cases, it might be a group you already identify with too much. In other cases, it may be groups that you feel are morally wrong or simply appalling. In either case, the objectivity requirement of fieldwork may make it too difficult for you to conduct your research. And again, that's okay. I feel like I'm trying to talk you out of qualitative research, so I do want to leave you with the positive aspect. The data that Dr. Simi collected is beyond what we ever could have gotten with survey questions, email correspondence, or blog analysis. Being in the living room of white supremacists, dining with them, attending their rallies and their music shows, gave him a true vision of what life is like inside the white power movement. And that view is so difficult to obtain that his research was an imperative addition to the literature on white power extremist groups. In case you're interested in viewing more of Dr. Simi's presentation, I provided his full talk on my website. We saw a short excerpt here around 22 minutes in, but he continues in more detail about how his study methods developed and what his findings were. I encourage you to check that out if you're interested. Dr. Simi's research is really interesting, and it's a great example of strong fieldwork and observation approach. All right, well, that concludes our discussion about qualitative research. Thanks for watching, everyone.